Welcome back to Community Update. My guest today is Augy Jones. Augy Jones is currently principal at NSCC's Akerley campus in Dartmouth. Previous to that, he was the executive lead inclusive education within the Nova Scotia Department of Education and the director of the African Canadian Services branch in the same department. Augy was born in Halifax, Nova Scotia. His full name, Augy, which translates to Black Panther. And Augy is here with me today to share thoughts and perspective on diversity and inclusion, especially as regards the African community here in Nova Scotia, and of course, Canada at large. It's good to have you in the studio.
Promise, it's great to be here, and I look forward to our conversation. I think it's needed. It's a great time to talk.
Absolutely, yeah. And of course, I don't think I've done enough to introduce who you are. Why don't you just tell us a bit more about yourself?
Well, I would consider myself an African Nova Scotian. I'm 54 years old and grew up here. My father was from Truro, and was Nova Scotian. My mom was originally from Boston, and she grew up in Oakville, Ontario. And they met, and my mom came from Toronto and married my dad and came here. I've been through this school system, grew up in Nova Scotia. I ended up becoming a teacher. And in the time that I was a teacher, I spent time teaching high school English here in Halifax. I taught 10 years in the Caribbean, Guyana, St. Lucia, Jamaica, Bahamas. I've taught at St Francis Xavier University. I was a professor in the School of Education. And, I also DJ. I have a reggae sound system that I have old school vinyl, so a lot of things. But a lot of what I do comes back to Africa. Like I really want to stress that today is that, Africa is a uniting point for us. And it's important for us to locate ourselves in that. And so even me being called Augusto by my parents, my other brother's name is Shaka, after Shaka Zulu, and my other brother's name is Patrice, after Patrice Lumumba. So we were Halifax boys, and we had these names that were connected to Africa. And so I grew up in a house that was very full of Black books and Black magazines and music, and my parents were very much central in our culture for the city and the province.
This is interesting, and given your background and your heritage, how has that influenced your life, probably your work and your career, if you like?
I think the community work. I think that I saw my parents spend a lot of time, maybe not with the kids. We knew that my parents were in a lot of committee meetings, and my father developed a transition year program, which is now Henson College. My father developed the IB&M law program at Dalhousie, which is for Indigenous and Black lawyers. My mother worked for legal aid for a long time and was almost like a liaison between the Black community and law, and would say to people, okay, yes, you need a lawyer. Oh no, you need Department of Community Services. She was kind of like a triage to make sure that our community, when they got in the justice system, was making the right choices of who to go to. So me becoming a teacher probably was not an accident, because that's community work with other people's children.
Yeah.
If you're teaching other people's children. The company that I've developed, which we'll talk about later, Empathize Others, is community work.
Right.
Working at Nova Scotia Community College. We have 14 campuses, but that campus is a traditional trades campus. So automotive, welding, carpentry, these culinary, hospitality, and that's also, I consider community work, to make sure that the people that come to that college get something, a piece of paper, so they can go out and work and make money and support their families, and be positive in the community. Yeah, so I think that's what I learned from my parents.
Interesting. Yeah. So you have a very impressive background that a whole lot of people who know you will always connect to your community, which is the African Nova Scotian community here. Yes. Tell us a little bit about the struggle that your community has been through, because for a lot of people, especially our viewers, would like to learn more about what had happened in the past or probably currently. Tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I believe knowledge is power. And so when you come to a community and you see people behaving a certain way and they're in a certain space, you wonder, that's different. I wonder why they act like that. Well, there's often a history, an intergenerational history. And so I would start out with, African Nova Scotians are unique in Canada. This isn't a Montreal conversation or a Toronto conversation or Calgary or Vancouver, those large urban centers. This is a story of it starts out with escaped slaves. So in the late 1700s, the British Empire was fighting against the Americans, and the Americans were becoming independent. And a large part of American power was the slave culture, because people work for free. If you have people working for free, you can make a lot of money. And so to destabilize the Americans, the British said, and put it out there to people of African ancestry, that if you escape from slave plantations in the U.S. along the eastern shore, and this would be from the Virginias all the way up to New York, New England, so black people escaped. And they came to Nova Scotia, which I think we should realize Nova Scotia in translation is New Scotland, right? So it's purposely New Scotland. And so when we escaped there, they called our community and our people who were former, enslaved in the U.S., they called them Black Loyalists. So thousands of eventually of escaped Africans who escaped slavery came here as Black Loyalists. And they were promised land and a new life and a life without slavery. Well, that didn't happen. Coming to Nova Scotia or coming to New Scotland, slaves were sold at the Grand Parade. So right where the buildings for the municipal government, right? In the back you have the Parade Square, right down from Five Fishermen, and that was a place where they sold slaves. Obviously because it's close to the harbor. Right. Also, many of the communities that we were promised land were communities that still exist outside of the center of Halifax, outside of where you can make money. So you think about Pockwalk in Hammonds Plains, Lucasville, Beachville, Cherrybrook, East Preston, North Preston. These are all communities way, way, way outside of Halifax. So from the beginning of the 1800s, there were black people here that were put in a situation to fail, because there was also no running water, no sewage. The land was infertile. And if you don't believe that, drive through those lands now. Like in 2023, you can't farm on those lands really, right? So it was put in a situation to fail. Put in a situation that you were promised something that you weren't given. And then I would just speak about, intergenerational trauma. Like, when we add that together over from the 1800s to the year 2000, that's a long time to be in a subservient position. And when I say this, I want your viewers to know this isn't a sad story. It's actually a story of resilience.
Resilience, yeah.
Right, but it would explain why there seems to be a hypersensitivity around being in New Scotland for people who are children of, had grandparents and great-grandparents that were the original settlers here that were put in really tough circumstances. Right. So we're 2% of the population now, presently. We were probably less than that. And I say that I remember my primary school picture, and there's 28 white kids and 2 black kids standing there, We didn't, and I don't, and you have to, after years and years of being the minority, so you turn on TV, you don't see yourself. There's not a lot of business owners who look like you. There's not a lot of doctors who look like you. And people may belittle that, but if I grow up in Nairobi, if I grow up in Lagos, if I grow up in Kingston, Jamaica, if I grow up in Castries, St. Lucia, that's one of the reasons why I went to the Caribbean to teach. I wanted to be around black people. I wanted to be in a majority situation rather than a minority. And those years were huge for my self-esteem. They were huge for my spirituality, around being in those places where when I turned on the TV, when I lived in the Caribbean, I saw black newscasters talking about black crime with black police people and black judges and black lawyers and black business people and black commercials. And if you grow up, if you're blessed to grow up with that, I need the viewers to understand that that is a blessing, because not everyone of African ancestry grow up like that. Right. When we grow up in Nova Scotia, we don't see ourselves that much. And so sadly, someone like myself, who's 54 years old, in 2023, was one of the first presidents of the student council of my junior high and my high school. And I coached college basketball. I was a women's basketball coach at St. FX. I was, the first African Nova Scotian to coach university basketball. Like, that's not a happy occasion for me to be the first person of African ancestry to do these things. But it goes to show you what it is to be in New Scotland. Right. And so when people are unaware of that, they come and they say, wow, these African Nova Scotian people are really sensitive about racism.
Yeah, I mean, you have a background that speaks so much about the history of, the Nova Scotian, the African Nova Scotian here, pardon. And having you in the studio to speak to that, and for us, it's a big privilege. And so indeed, I'd like to understand, from your own lens, how does the other community see people who come in here, and how can we build that bridge, to connect both communities, like people who've recently moved to Nova Scotia, who are of the African ancestry, and the ones we've met here. How can we build that bridge?
Yeah, that, again, another great question. I think it's things like this. Right. It's conversations like this, and many of the episodes you've already done. Mm-hmm. I also think it's, and this would be, when I went to Jamaica, I really did a lot of research around Jamaica to know where I was going. And when I went to St. Lucia, I did a lot of research on St. Lucia, which is a country that was both French and English. And so they have a Creole, a patois that links to Martinique and Guadeloupe and Haiti. So St. Lucia is a different place to be, but I had to research before I went. In Jamaica, I had to research before I went. Before I went to Guyana, and I had to know about Walter Rodney, and I had to know about what was going on in Guyana. So my first thing would be, when you come to Nova Scotia, there is a history of Black people in Nova Scotia that's important to know about. Yeah, it's important. Right? Like, I think it is. And as I said to you previous to us getting, recording, was, there's not a lot of people who are newcomers that move to North Preston or Cherrybrook or Pockwalk, so they're not, people are not moving into those communities to organically get that history. Right. You're moving to Clayton Park, you're moving to Bedford, you're moving to, maybe West Halifax, which is understandable. That's not a criticism. It's just that, I think there's an understanding of African Nova Scotians, but I would say it goes the other way too. I think African Nova Scotians have to understand that they're African. All right. You see, and that's where the meat is, because my parents, in naming me Augusto, and fighting for civil rights here in this minority situation, I have a love for Africa, right? And I want, and I would long to put my foot on Africa, in Africa, and I haven't done that, right? And so there's got to be a uniting of our situations, rather than, African Nova Scotians aren't allowing us to do this and do that. And really, I'll be honest, I think African Nova Scotians are fighting for stuff that they've been fighting for decades. That it's a separate conversation from someone that's coming from Ghana and someone that's coming from Nigeria. That is not the issue. I think the issue is the African Nova Scotian community continuously going back to a government that is a Eurocentric government that is not hearing around education, justice, community services, healthcare. Like, there's documented, researched reasons. And so if we talk about PSD and post-traumatic stress, well, think about intergenerational trauma, right? It's handed down from a grandparent to a parent to a child. So, and it keeps going. And so you wonder why in 2020, where, there's a population that seems to be unsettled, seems to be angry, seems to be, those are all signs of trauma, and it's not to say other people don't have that. Yep. So I think there's an understanding, and I think people who are African or Nova Scotian have to understand themselves as African, but yet of African ancestry. But I'll tell you, that's what happens when you're in a minority situation, and you end up, some of the things that are attached to you as you're growing up are things like you steal and you're not smart and you're a pimp or you're a prostitute or you're a criminal. Like, people may think that these are not things that happen, but these are ways of thinking
yeah.
that do happen. So when you grow up in that, I was able to navigate that really because of my parents letting me know that I was African. Like, that was my armor. So no one could say anything to me to make me feel lesser, which has made me president of the student council of an all-white school, president of the student council of an all-white high school. To go to a university setting like St Francis Xavier, which is a white Catholic university, and not only be a professor there, but also coach the basketball team there. And so going to the Department of Ed, that job as provincial lead, executive lead, inclusive education. Yeah. I was the head of inclusive education for the province. That's a unique role to be held by someone of African ancestry. Right. So I would say to the community that there's a love for Africa that I have and a knowledge of myself as being of African ancestry that led to me doing those things. Right. But not everyone grew up that way here.
I know, right? And before the interview, you talked about this very a project you're involved in, the Empathize Others project. I think you were passionate about that, speaking to that project. Tell us a little bit about that platform and what you do there.
Yeah, it's actually a consulting business that I have, Empathize Others Consulting Services, and it came out of the years and years of work I'd be doing where I was talking to teachers and talking to police and talking to businesses and talking to government organizations around the reality of being in this minority situation. And I thought, okay, so how can I frame it so that, one, people are listening and don't feel like you're saying, oh, you're a racist. Like, that doesn't go anywhere when people shut down. So what I started to find is the more that I opened up the conversation to what it's like to be an other, right? So I would come into the room and say to people, like, we all feel comfortable around people that talk like us, look like us, think like us. Okay, that's good. But in 2023, leadership and productivity is actually probably judged by how you can deal with people that don't talk like you, don't think like you, and don't look like you. Think about the global nature of the internet and where we've gone since the early 2000s. You can't just be in a silo thinking that I only deal with these type of people. So Empathize Others was a platform where I have a website, I blog, I have a podcast. I bring on guests that are community-minded people, similar to Community Update.
Doing, yeah.
I as a consultant, I worked with Pink Larkin, I've worked with McGuinness Cooper, I've worked with Canada Revenue. I now work with Armbray Academy as an inclusive education consultant. I work with Acadia Women's Basketball as an inclusive culture consultant, as a coach. But I'm not on the basketball side of it. I'm on the inclusive side of it. So I found that when I put the conversation into that I'm an able-bodied male, who is heterosexual, who has 3 university degrees. I have a lot of privileges, right? So I have to own those privileges. So for example, as an able-bodied person, I've never come to a building that I couldn't get through. I can go escalators, stairs, elevators. Well, I need to own that part of myself in order to understand that there's people with physical disabilities who can't get into buildings to make the meetings that they're supposed to meet. As a person who's a heterosexual, I can, in public, hug my wife, kiss my wife, hold her hand. Mm-hmm. And there's no sense of me being threatened by random people. But if I was in a same-sex situation, as soon as you show a public show of affection, there is a threat that somebody is going to take offense to that and randomly be aggressive with you. Right. There's a privilege. There's a privilege to be being male. As a male, I don't jog with one earbud in, but many females jog with one earbud in because they have to listen and make sure they know what's going, like me being in Kingston, Jamaica, living in Portmore. I'm a 6'1", 220-pound male. There's a privilege for me to be able to live in Jamaica like that. Right. That's a male privilege. And so when I own my own privileges, it allows me to hear the disability community more clear. Right. I hear the LGBTQ plus community more clear. Right. I hear the indigenous community, because this is Mi'kma'ki, right? I'm a settler here. Yeah. This is indigenous land. And so when Indigenous people are talking about situations that are often very similar to us, being that 2% minority and how it is to be connected to Europe, those same things come up. So Empathize Others was very much a platform that I tried to make more inclusive, so that we were talking to people about the value of we use the word neuroplasticity, the brain, neuro being plastic. And being elastic and being stretchable. And how stretchable is your brain? Expandable. How we're listening to other voices. So that's this platform.
Very interesting. Like I said, you were very passionate about this project. But let's talk about the African heritage. And our viewers would just want to know what is usually done. What really is about this African heritage thing in a very quick moment. I think about that. Particularly the month. I mean, I think we're just somewhere around there.
It's February. It's February.
So tell us a little bit about that one too.
Well, to be honest, it's a fix to the fact that, there are cultural celebrations out of South Africa and Kenya in Jamaica. We think about, even if it's just Carnival or Junkanoo in Bahamas, or, there's celebrations that have been there for decades, hundreds of years, that were passed down. We don't have that in New Scotland. And so, what happens is, and there's mixed feelings around this. February is a time to celebrate. And I think for your own wellness, there has to be a time where you celebrate your resilience. So when I recounted for your viewers the history of us being here, then February is a time for us to celebrate that history and share that history. And so when you don't have a connection to the land, right? Because we don't. We were put on bad land in the 1800s, and actually the land is Mi'kmaq. Our land, my ancestral land, is in Africa, right? It is. I'm of African ancestry. So I'm far from there. So Black History Month is a celebration that lacks that connection to Africa, but yet it's the best we can do in Canada to celebrate the same way Italians would, the same way many people have a month, a time where you show your films and you share. And I think that it's not even an outward facing thing, Promise, that people are supposed to learn something. I don't think it's that. The more that comes to mind. February is 28 days. It's the shortest month. So if everything needs to be crammed into 28 days, I don't think that's really the purpose. I think that the purpose is to celebrate and to honor and to showcase. I think it's a community wellness, right? In order to do that, because there's so much grinding, that if you don't put your head up from that grind and celebrate yourself, and this is even individually, we have to do that as fathers, as brothers. We have to somehow spend some time honoring ourselves, right? And so that's on a micro level. So I think on a macro level, February is set up to do that. I would say that my parents were one of the pioneers of that, and including, we think about Kwanzaa at Christmas. Kwanzaa is an African celebration that was created by an African American. It's not connected to, I work with my academic chair at Akerley, Godfrey Odinga, is from Kenya. And he tells me about his traditions that are generational, right? It's not Kwanzaa, nobody made it up, right? They didn't make up Black History Month. So when you don't have that ancestral connection to the land and a celebratory something that's been there hundreds of years, you come up with a month.
Absolutely.
And so with that month, we try to do what we can to honor. And this is where I think that really brings you to probably the most important thing I said, is we need people from Africa.
Right.
We need, because I think we get into tension and by not knowing each other, that we end up being I don't think it's there. I think that, we're learning now. Alfred Burgesson is originally from Ghana, and he grew up in Cape Breton, and he now has a tribe network. Alfred is making those connections. Right. Kenneth is making those connections. Right. There are people making those connections. If we would get together and talk more and share, I think that there's a huge opportunity for everybody to be able to, because I think, for us, African Nova Scotians, more of us have to get to Africa. Yeah. Yeah. You know what I mean? And what means, because I think that we are there's a sense of being lost in New Scotland. Yeah. right?
Yeah,
So
I was going to ask that question. How can the immigrants here be part of what's going on here and contribute better to the community, the bigger community, which is the African Canadians who are here in Nova Scotia? How can these immigrants be part of what's going on, indeed?
Well,
politically and otherwise, if you like.
Yeah, I think there's a relational piece too, to understand that we are not anti-Africa at all. Like, we are just traumatized.
Right.
You know what I mean? And see it as that. Like, it's not anything against anyone from Nigeria, against anyone from Kenya, against anyone from South Africa. It's not that. Right. It's our focus has always been this grind of being the 2%. And so it's hard to get away from that grind. And there are things that we don't know about ourselves that we have to learn, especially if you think about people from West Africa, because the slave trade geographically came out of West Africa.
That's right.
And we think about, there is a connection between Sierra Leone and Freetown, and Sierra Leone is connected to our Halifax Harbor. So I think that there are things where we can exchange. There's an exchange. I think there's a knowledge of New Scotland that we should be able to pass on to people who are newcomers, who are from Africa, because you need to know where you're at.
Correct.
Right? And so that you get a job in government or you get a job here, you have to know what's going on here.
What's going on there.
Politically, so that you don't get duped by that same thing. So you get brought in because you grew up and you went to university in Africa and you're qualified. You're an expert in your field.
Right. And
you come here and the government is still the same government that we've been dealing with. Right. And so we need to be in solidarity rather than disconnected. Because in our solidarity, all of our excellence can flow to the front.
Yeah. So you have, as we wrap up anyways, you have quite impressive achievement, list of things that you've done. I mean, representing the community, and your current position is something more than enough to celebrate, actually. And a lot of people will look at you as a role model. What exactly will you be telling them as we wrap up? And maybe I'll go a little bit into your own personal life, a little bit personal. When last did you visit Africa, and when do you intend to do something that will bring in the immigrant into your personal project, the Empathize Others project?
Yes, well, for me, I think, in linking, I'm on the board for Tribe Network. Right. So I know that there's links that already, Alfred's in Ghana, he went for Christmas, and I'm looking at him saying, like, I would love to be there. Godfrey Odinga was just in Kenya through NSCC. Okay. I would like to make those links as well. There's a lot of things happening, actually. And I think there has to be this bridge. If we think about a metaphorical bridge that goes over the Atlantic Ocean and connects Nova Scotia to Africa, I want to walk across that bridge. Right. And I think it's so that we have that, because we need Africa. We need to touch the ground. Right. We need to know the culture. We need to know, like, that's something that was cut off from us. So when you see us in the way we act, it's someone that had the umbilical cord cut off.
Oh, yeah, correct. Yeah.
Right. So that's why we behave the way we do, and we need to reattach it, and we need to get the blood flowing through it and get that energy. Yeah. And so that's what I think. I mean, for me, any opportunity to get to Africa is what I'm looking for. But also, I would say that I know from my connections that I think in the near future, I'm going to be I would love to be that mediator that brings those communities together. Right. Because there's a real need for us to do that. And it really, I think, is just a socializing situation. It's sitting down, slowing down our lives, and making time to get to know each other. And if we just go to work, come home, go to work, come home, go to work, come home, we will never get to know each other.
That's correct. Yeah, basically. I mean, if I have the entire night to talk to you, I don't think it's still enough. You're someone who connects us to the history that a lot of people are interested in. And I'd like to thank you for this time you've given us to have a peek into what life is here for Africans in Nova Scotia. Thank you for coming to the show.
Thank you for inviting me.
And that was Augy Jones, a public speaker and current principal at NSCC Akerley campus. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel and check out for other episodes of Community Update while you're here. You can also follow us on social media and let us know what you think by sending us an email to communityupdateNS@gmail.com. Till I come your way again, I am Augie, and bye for now.